Hey guys, tonight we're stretching out on a rooftop somewhere in ancient Persia, under a sky so clean and dark, it looks like a velvet bowl turned upside down. The stars flicker not like electric bulbs, but like slow-breathing fireflies caught in molasses. You're lying on a cushion, palm leaves rustling nearby, and there is an old astronomer next to you muttering things about birds. Yes, birds, because tonight, the stars aren't lions or scorpions or bears. They're wings and feathers and long-lost doves. Someone named hundreds of years ago. You're probably not going to survive this level of nerdy serenity. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge softly across an adobe rooftop in Nishapur. The night is cool but not cold. The kind of air that presses gently on your cheeks without asking for a cloak. Somewhere below, a clay jug tips over, spilling date wine on someone's cat. But up here, above the noise of merchants and donkeys and Persian gossip, is the quiet vastness of the desert sky. And it's full of birds, well, metaphorically. See, the early Persian astronomers didn't just map stars for navigation or divine the emperor's next dental crisis. They looked at those shimmering dots and thought in metaphors. One star twitched like a dove's tail in a breeze. Another flickered red, like a cardinal mid-molt. There was even a pale grouping in the eastern sky they swore looked like a migrating goose, its neck bent just so. And because humans are chronically incapable of leaving things unnamed, they started giving them proper titles. Al-Ghurab. They murmured the raven. Simurgh's wing. They imagined, for a mythical bird that made eagles look like lazy chickens. Some names stuck. Others faded, like chalk drawings in a rainstorm. But the idea took flight, pun absolutely intended. The earliest records we have of bird-themed star names don't survive in pristine scrolls locked in golden libraries. Nope. They're mostly whispered hints inside later manuscripts, awkward translations, and things accidentally copied into the margins of astrological cookbooks. Historians still argue whether some of these bird-star associations started with Persian astrologers or were imported through earlier Babylonian and Assyrian traditions, where celestial animals also strutted across the heavens. But Persia did something special. They added poetry to it. You sit beside a young student, barely past puberty, staring wide-eyed at the stars while his mentor, an old man with eyebrows like broomsticks, recites verse. The falcon flies from Capricorn to Leo, tail to beak in silence below the moon's glow. Is that a flight path? Or a metaphor for fate? Or just a creative excuse for why crops failed that year? Hard to say. Meanwhile, you spot a servant lighting an oil lamp too close to a parchment map. The flame flickers just like the star they called Altair, which later becomes known across cultures as the flying eagle. This name survives. By the way, in modern astronomy, Altair is still part of the summer triangle. So next time someone asks if Persian star names meant anything, just point up at that bird. Not all stars got elegant bird names, though one in particular, translated from a forgotten dialect, was essentially called the chick that can't find its nest. Adorable, also mildly tragic. You imagine some ancient astronomer, sleep-deprived and hungry, naming stars like a toddler names toys. This one's pointy wing, that one's angry beak, and that lonely one, yeah, that's lost chick. Some bird star names were meant to warn. In particular, a cluster low on the western horizon, known among shepherds as the murder of nightbirds, was associated with ill omens, especially for travelers or sheep. One fringe scholar in the 18th century even claimed these stars inspired an old Persian bedtime story, The Owls Who Waited to Steal Dreams. Creepy. Yes. Verified. Absolutely not. But you tuck it away anyway. Because it's the kind of thing that lingers in the shadows when you close your eyes. As you lie back, the air cools just enough to make you shift your weight on the cushion. A whisper of wind rustles a hanging chime made of pigeon bones. Don't ask why. And a single star flares briefly brighter than the rest. A dove. Maybe, or maybe just a coincidence. But back then, every flicker was meaningful. Every shimmer was a message. And if that message happened to come with feathers, so be it. You watch the old astronomer lift a wooden pointer decorated with goose quills, because why not, and trace a line from Orion's belt to a nearby cluster. Bird trail. He says in Farsi, watch long enough and they'll fly. You do. You watch. They don't, but you don't mind. Because tonight, it's enough to believe. You slip off the rooftop and shuffle down a narrow stone stairway, your footsteps echoing softly between mud brick walls. The scent of cooling earth mixes with saffron smoke as you move toward a peculiar structure tucked behind the city's outer edge, a dome-shaped observatory, half buried in sand, half whispered about in town gossip. Locals say it's where the stars go to gossip about humans. The place doesn't look like much. A few wooden beams, a cracked dome, a staircase leading underground. But once you duck beneath its low archway, it all shifts. The air stills, the silence grows dense, and your feet land on cold tile patterned with bird feathers, no kidding. The entire floor is mosaicked with painted plumes. Peacocks, doves, hawks, even something that looks like a feathered snake. This was no ordinary stargazing den. Early Persian astronomers, especially in the regions near Yazd and Ray, didn't just peer at the sky for weather updates. They built these observatories, some in cities, some hidden in desert plains, to study the heavens with method, reverence, and just a dash of theatrical flair. You settle onto a cool stone bench beside a rusting astrolabe mounted on a carved pillar. Above you, a dome opens to the night sky like a peeled fruit. And here's a fun detail. Most of these observatories weren't built to look impressive. They were meant to disappear. Historians still argue whether the dome designs were intentionally low profile so they wouldn't draw imperial attention or simply a budget issue. Either way, these scholars preferred sand over spotlight. A student with charcoal-stained fingers walks past you holding a delicate star chart, the corners curled from sweat and age. He pauses beside a mosaic of a bird mid-dive. This, he murmurs, was how we found the seasons. You squint at the ceiling. The chart lines up with an open slit in the dome, at a particular angle, at a specific date. A single star slides perfectly into view through that crack, what they called the Nightjay. Not an official constellation in today's books, but a beloved unofficial one in 10th century Persia. Why a jay? Because they thought it sang to the moon. Also because a jay had flown into the dome once and refused to leave for a week. Superstitions are nothing if not convenient. You follow the student deeper into the chambers. Along the hallway walls, old instruments rest in cradles citing tubes, quadrant stones, intricate sundials carved with, well, birds. A lot of birds. You pass a bronze mural of a heron mid-flight. Beneath it, a scratched inscription reads something like, "He watches from the tail of Virgo." Poetic, yes. Scientifically rigorous, dubious, but charming. Absolutely. The observatory wasn't just a science lab, it was a canvas. These astronomers had a flair for drama. Some scholars even wore feathered cloaks during solstice ceremonies. There's one record, possibly exaggerated, of a famous sky watcher arriving at court draped in actual peacock feathers, claiming Jupiter had told him to wear them. The king laughed, then promoted him. And then there's the acoustics. As you whisper, your voice bounces gently between the stone ribs of the ceiling. Ancient texts mention this echo being deliberate, amplifying recitations during celestial rituals. You can almost hear it now. A long-lost chant about the hawk of the horizon spiraling into view at dawn. Outside, a breeze slips through the slit in the dome. Dust dances on a beam of moonlight. A few grains fall into your lap, golden and gritty, like desert glitter. You brush them off, but one catches on your sleeve, tiny, stubborn, persistent. Like the theories written here, there's a rumor that one observatory kept a live starling for years, believing its songs foretold celestial events. Of course, modern science rolls its eyes, but deep down, even you admit you kind of want that to be true. Before you leave, you glance back at this dome's center. The constellations have shifted slightly. One star pulses low in the east, the heron's eye. They called it, just bright enough to be mistaken for a real eye in the dark. One manuscript even claims the star blinked once, literally blinked. Historians mostly chalk that up to eye fatigue or a clever metaphor, but still, blinked. You climb the stairs again, the observatory vanishing behind you like a secret swallowed by sand. Up above, The stars continue their slow drift. You trace an imaginary beak in the sky. It's probably just a triangle, but it could be a bird. You wander east, further into Nishapur, where the stars feel closer somehow, maybe because the buildings here are shorter, or maybe because the air carries fewer arguments. Either way, the sky looms like an ink-drenched ceiling, pinpricked with light, and tucked into a quiet alley, hidden behind a curtain of dried date palms, is a room filled with parchment and the faintest scent of roasted pistachio. This is the scribe's den. But not just any scribe. This one specializes in celestial documentation. And not just any celestial documentation specifically, star maps with birds. You sit down beside a scroll that's half unrolled on the floor, its edges curling like old bread. The ink has faded into a sort of sleepy brown, and you notice something unusual. The constellation labels aren't in traditional Greek or Latin names like Scorpius or Cassiopeia. No, these stars are marked with bird names. Al-Safina, the boat dove, Tayir al-Layl, the night flyer, and your personal favorite, Zanbarak, which translates loosely to tiny angry bird, and yes, that was probably a real name. The scroll is signed in cramped Persian script by a scribe named Javad al-Nishapuri, dated around the 11th century. He wasn't an astronomer himself, just a copyist. But boy, did he get creative? Historians still argue whether these bird star scrolls were poetic license or part of a now-lost academic tradition. Some claim Javad was simply illustrating metaphors used in teaching celestial motion. Others say he belonged to a quiet circle of naturalist philosophers who believed the heavens mirrored the animal kingdom. What we do know is that Javad's bird scrolls resurfaced centuries later, misfiled in a merchant's estate under a stack of shipping manifests and love poetry. You imagine someone pulling it out, expecting to read about cinnamon prices, and instead finding a giant dove chasing Saturn across a parchment sky. You trace the ink with your finger. Each constellation is drawn not with dots, but with feather shapes. Arcs represent wingspans. Curves denote beaks. One particular star, now recognized in modern astronomy as Beta Cygni, was labeled here as Al-Hammama the dove. Still makes sense, since it's part of the Cygnus constellation. But here, in Javid's version, the entire sky has been translated into a sort of celestial aviary. There's even a marginal note written hurriedly, like someone whispering while being watched next to the star now known as Deneb. The swan forgets it is a swan. What does that mean? Was Javad musing about identity? Or maybe he just liked poetic riddles? You'll never know. Beside the scroll sits a bowl of lapis pigment, cracked and dry. The scribe likely used it for the brightest stars, the ones said to sing. Though science today would prefer the term vibrate, you imagine Javad dipping his brush, painting each dot with reverence, whispering names like lullabies, peacock eye, raven nest, finch leap. Not all of the birds make sense. There's one constellation labeled the glass crane, which doesn't show up in any other manuscript. Scholars have argued about it for years. Was it a mistranslation? A dream? A prank? A few think it was a metaphor for a comet that streaked across the sky during Javad's lifetime, its shimmer resembling fragile wings. No proof. Of course, just speculation. Still, you sit there, cross-legged on the floor, and wonder what it would be like to look up and see a crane made of light arching from horizon to zenith. Would you name it too, or just sit quietly, letting the moment pass? A cat sneaks in through the curtain, stares at you, and promptly sits under the scroll labeled Swallow's Ladder. Typical. You gently scoot the feline off, revealing a diagram that connects 6 stars in a zigzag meant to mimic the chaotic but purposeful flutter of a swallow mid-hunt. According to one of Javad's footnotes, this pattern was used to teach children the timing of lunar phases. When the swallow folds its wings, he writes, "You will know the moon is shy." Is that science? Maybe not by today's standards, but you can't deny the elegance. Eventually, the oil lamp beside you gutters, casting long shadows over the parchment. The ink looks like veins now branches on a celestial bird, stretching infinitely across the sky. Before you leave, You tuck the scroll back under the merchant ledgers, gently, reverently, as if the birds drawn there might get startled. Above, you step back into the open air, and the stars have moved again just slightly. A new wingtip appears over the eastern rooftops. The dove is flying. You're following a caravan now slowly, carefully, the way someone might trail behind a particularly philosophical turtle. The wheels creak, the camels grumble, the air tastes like cinnamon dust and sun-baked cloth. You've left the stone courtyards of Nishapur behind and are somewhere along the Silk Road, that ancient arterial lifeline winding its way across Persia. But tonight, it's not silk that catches your eye. It's feathers and stars. The traders ahead aren't just hauling textiles, spices, and stories. Tucked among their bundles are scrolls, inks, peacock feathers tied to prayer amulets, and tiny metal discs etched with celestial coordinates. The night sky above is their compass and, apparently, also their bird-watching guide. You sit beside a merchant named Fairuz, who claims he once saw a constellation flap its wings. Not a metaphor, not a dream. I swear it moved. He insists, holding a dried parrot feather, like it's a court testimony. Over Samarkand, summer solstice. Stars don't twinkle like that unless they're itching. You nod politely, deciding not to challenge the physics of itchy stars. But Firuz isn't the only one blending astronomy with avian obsession. Many Silk Road traders carried celestial maps embroidered with birds not just because they were beautiful, but because birds symbolized messages, directions, even divine intervention. Historians still argue whether these motifs were purely decorative or encoded mnemonic tools. Some scrolls seem to align winged shapes with lunar cycles, or match migrating bird routes with star positions at equinox. You unfurl one such map in the back of a spice wagon. It's woven in gold thread over deep indigo silk. At the center, a phoenix-like bird spiraling around a blazing star. Firuz calls it the fire-tailed rooster, though others label it Simurgh spine. Either way, it's not on your standard astronomy charts. The Simurgh, by the way, was a massive mythical bird in Persian lore, part peacock, part dog, part lion, because clearly one animal wasn't enough. Said to live in the tree of all seeds, and wise enough to guide kings, it was naturally believed to have its own constellation, or 5. Sources vary wildly. A few maps even suggest the Simurgh constellation moved locations over centuries, possibly a result of stellar precession, or possibly just dramatic storytelling. In one scroll dated to around the 12th century, the Simurgh is shown flying from east to west across the celestial dome, each star along its body named after different parts of a bird. Claw of judgment, feather of dawn, eye of silence. You gently trace the pattern, wondering which ones survived. Turns out, a few modern star names in Arabic or Latin may have morphed from these. Al-Jannah, the wing, Al-Qaid, the leader, and even Altair, flying eagle, carry echoes of ancient wings. Fairuz points to a cluster of stars in the northwest. That, he says, is where the sky herons sleep. You'll never see them fly, only ever settling. You stare hard. It just looks like a lopsided square. Still, there's something soothing in believing that even imaginary herons need rest. One scholar traveling with the caravan shows you a stitched diary where he's recorded star positions alongside bird migration sightings, an early kind of data correlation, if we're being generous. In his notes, he claims that cranes appear on the southern horizon exactly 3 nights before the full moon of the harvest season. Coincidence? Maybe, but to him, it was a navigational system. Bird above, bird below. He scribbles, one sky. Others weren't so literal. You flip through a poetic treatise by a merchant mystic who claims birds are fragments of constellations fallen to earth. Feathers, he writes, are what stars would shed if they feared falling. That's not science. That's something else. But you scribble it in the margins anyway. By the fire, someone retells the story of the crow that hid the moon, a tale shared across caravans where a starbird steals lunar light and nests in the stars. It's allegorical. Probably, maybe, but no one here is drawing the line too strictly between myth and map. The caravan pauses at a small oasis. You step away, the fire crackling behind you, and lie on the cool sand. The stars above twinkle maybe more than usual, maybe not. Your eyes drift upward, and you see them, vague bird shapes drawn in light, each dot connected not with lines, but with suggestion. You imagine someone, hundreds of years ago, doing exactly this, tracing imaginary wings across the heavens, feeling less lost because something up there mirrored the beating in their chest. A soft wind stirs the sand beside you, and somewhere above, the fire-tailed rooster keeps glowing. You wake to the sound of talons clicking on stone, or maybe it's just a rooster somewhere off behind the palm trees. Either way, dawn is cracking open the sky like a soft egg, and you're in a palace garden now. Not just any palace, though. This is one of the royal retreats, tucked somewhere near ancient Ctesiphon, where kings once strolled under hanging vines and talked about the stars, like they were old friends with complicated pasts. The air smells of figs and wet tile. A peacock screams in the distance, because of course it does, and seated in a marble pavilion surrounded by cushions, citrus trees, and at least 2 fainting poets is the royal astrologer. His beard is oiled, his robe is embroidered with constellations stitched in silver thread, and yes, there is a falcon perched on his wrist. Naturally, you settle into the shade just in time to hear him explain how the position of the owl star correlates to decisions about war, taxes, and somewhat unexpectedly pomegranate harvests. The falcon, meanwhile, stares at you like it knows your credit score. It turns out birds weren't just metaphors for these stargazers. In Persian court culture, certain birds held symbolic weight: owls for wisdom, falcons for power, doves for purity, and peacocks, well, peacocks were there to remind everyone of how much peacocks loved being peacocks. But each of these creatures found its way into the sky. The stars were not neutral. They carried judgment, identity, and, if you were lucky, a bit of courtly drama. The astrologer points his ringed finger to a particularly bright star. That, he says with a yawn, is where the falcon of destiny lands before change. You try not to blink. The star looks like all the others, but according to his worn scroll, it flares on the eve of battle or during royal succession. Historians still argue whether these associations were sincere beliefs or elaborate performance art. After all, court astrologers had to entertain as much as they informed. Telling the king, "You're going to lose your next campaign," might get you exiled, but saying, "The falcon has turned its wing away from the enemy," that's poetic and vague. A survival skill in glittery shoes. You wander through the palace corridors and find mural after mural of skybirds in flight. One fresco shows the Simurgh diving between constellations, flanked by smaller sparrow stars. Another shows a proud eagle gazing over what is unmistakably a star chart, drawn as if it were the eagle's territory. A hidden metaphor for sovereignty, maybe, or a not-so-subtle reminder of who owned the skies. In one alcove, a long scroll labeled "Birds of the Celestial Court" outlines 7 star clusters, each assigned to a royal bird. The names translate roughly as the falcon's hook, the dove's ring, the owl's watch, the peacock's fan, the crane's bend, the parrot's flame, the crow's echo. Each was believed to govern a different mood or fate: war, love, memory, arrogance, time, voice, and endings. Weirdly specific, yes, but useful. If you were deciding who to marry during an eclipse, the astrologer's apprentice, who looks about 12 and keeps dropping things, tells you that each star group had a corresponding ritual. For example, when the dove's ring rose above the horizon, young lovers would toss feathers into fountains, whispering their secrets as the stars turned overhead. A little theatrical, maybe, but don't pretend you wouldn't try it. You reach the back of the garden, where a neglected sundial leans into a pomegranate tree. It's carved in the shape of a bird's wing, with hour markers etched along the feather bones, the gnomon. The thing that casts the shadow is a stylized talon. You step closer, and for a moment, your own shadow falls perfectly over the noon mark. The Falcon's Hour. The court records claim that decisions made during the Falcon's Hour carried extra weight, so much so that it was said a general once delayed a siege for 2 days waiting for the talon to strike 12. Spoiler: He still lost, but the falcon looked majestic. Not all bird stars were about strength, though the crow's echo, according to several dusty manuscripts, was associated with memory. Whenever it appeared near the moon, scribes were instructed to recopy old knowledge scrolls, laws, family names so it wouldn't fade from time. Ironically, many of those same scrolls are now unreadable due to ink corrosion. The stars gave advice. The humidity ignored it. As the palace fades behind you, the peacock screams again. You look up, and there it is. A bright blue star, barely visible now in the daylight, said to be the peacock's fan. It shimmers faintly, like it knows you're looking. You wonder if, centuries from now, someone will stand in the same spot and call that same star something else entirely. Maybe Delta Aquili or HIP 97649, or maybe just maybe they'll still call it what this garden once whispered. The bird that watched kings sleep. You're sitting under a low roof, deep in the corner of a manuscript library that smells like rain-soaked parchment and overly ambitious dreams. The stone floor is cool under your feet. Outside, the sun is bright. But in here, everything is ink, shadow, and muttering scholars who haven't seen daylight in 3 weeks. You flip through a worn codex. The script flows like waves. But what really catches your eye is the painting stretched across 2 pages. A peacock, majestic and smug, cradling a cluster of stars in its tail, and next to it, an argument, ink-scrawled, frantic, and possibly angry. 2 names are scribbled beside the star cluster. Ayn al-Tawus, Eye of the Peacock, and Ayn al-Ghazal, Eye of the Gazelle. Same constellation, different stories. You, friend, have stumbled upon one of the oldest arguments in Persian astronomy. Who gets naming rights to the pretty stars? This is the peacock argument. You glance around, no one's looking, so you keep reading. Turns out, somewhere around the 10th century, Persian and Arab scholars began debating which mythological creature best represented a particular group of stars near what we now call the constellation Pavo. Some insisted it resembled the elaborate tail of a peacock. Others argued it was clearly the watchful gaze of a desert gazelle. A third camp. Because there's always a third camp, suggested it looked more like a melon seed, which feels like it should have been disqualified on the visual grounds alone. Historians still argue whether this debate was scientific or just literary posturing. It's very possible that someone insulted someone else's favorite bird and things escalated unnecessarily. You know how academia is? You turn the page. A scholar named Mahdi ibn Khosrow outlines his 4 avian criteria for celestial accuracy. They are plumage symmetry, navigational metaphor, potential, royal association, general bird-like energy. You're not sure what bird-like energy means, but you respect it. Mahdi argues passionately in favor of the peacock. He believed its iridescent tail mirrored the color shifts seen in atmospheric refraction around the star cluster. Also, he had peacocks in his courtyard, so bias is very likely, but not everyone agreed. A rival scholar, Zainab al-Rafi, countered that the stars blinked too rapidly to represent a composed peacock and were better matched to the nervous darting of a gazelle's eyes at dusk. She adds a footnote. Also, peacocks are deeply annoying. You sense some personal history there. The argument continues across multiple manuscripts, spilling into diagrams, marginal notes, and at least one extremely sassy poem that rhymes plumage with hubris. You quietly admire the pettiness of the ancient intellectual elite. This wasn't just about birds. It was about authority. Who had the right to name the sky? Persian scholars, with their myth-laden metaphors. Arab scholars, focused on precision and Islamic cosmology. Traveling poets, who insisted every star should rhyme with longing. The stars weren't moving, but the arguments definitely were. You pull another manuscript from a shelf, the parchment crackles like dry leaves. This one's older, with a half-erased constellation labeled Janna's Roost, possibly a reference to paradise. The accompanying illustration is unclear. It might be a peacock, or a flamingo, or an extremely surprised duck. The debate continues. What's charming, though, is that despite all the disagreement, everyone agreed on one thing. Birds belonged in the stars. Whether they were symbols of pride, omens of fate, or reminders of distant lands, birds felt right. They soared, they nested, They migrated. They whispered of cycles and return, and that, in the minds of ancient sky watchers, made them more celestial than lions or bulls ever could be. You close the manuscript and look up. A skylight lets in a single beam of golden light, catching on motes of dust. The stars aren't visible right now, but they're up there, and you know somewhere in that endless velvet there's a peacock still arguing with a gazelle about who deserves to shine brighter. Spoiler, it's the duck. You've wandered farther than expected through dusty gardens, forgotten alleys, and half-spoken memories until you find yourself at the edge of a courtyard glowing in candlelight. The smell of rosewater lingers in the air, and quiet music hums from a corner where an oud player gently plucks the night awake. A group of Sufi mystics sit cross-legged in a circle, their robes soft as whispers, their eyes turned not inward, but skyward. You settle near the edge, careful not to interrupt. One of them, an older man with a beard like spun wool and the gentlest voice you've ever heard, is speaking. Birds, he says, fly in both directions up to the stars and down into the heart. You blink. Okay, this might be your favorite astronomy lecture so far. The Sufis weren't conventional stargazers. They didn't record constellations for kings or chart eclipses for military campaigns. They looked at the heavens as a mirror for the soul, and the stars, for them, were birds of memory, fragments of divine light in feathered disguise. You're handed a small scroll. The paper is rough, handmade, stained in the corner with what might be tea. It's a poem, no title, just lines flowing like wind. Night birds rise on unseen thermals, calling to each other across galaxies. One star is a falcon, one is a wound. Both lead you home. You lean back. A breeze stirs the lanterns. One of the mystics begins drawing in the dust, simple arcs and dots, a kind of improvised star chart. But instead of connecting lines, he draws wings. This, he says, is the path of return. The soul follows the bird of the west until it disappears. When it reappears in the east, you are new. Historians still argue whether these skybirds were literal constellations or metaphors for stages of spiritual awakening. Some believe certain Sufi sects created entirely new celestial systems. Star maps not based on Greek astronomy, but on dream cycles, trance visions, and feather symbolism. One manuscript describes a bird called Tayir al-Sur, the bird of secrets. It supposedly appeared only to those in deep meditation. Its associated star cluster remains unidentified, though some modern scholars speculate it may refer to the faint outline of the constellation Delphinus. Others say it never existed. But try telling that to a mystic who saw it mid-prayer and wept. You hear another tale softly told, like a lullaby with sharp teeth about the sky heron and the broken star. In the story, a heron carries a shattered piece of heaven in its beak, trying to return it to its proper place. The Sufis believe this was a metaphor for memory, how humans carry fragments of light they no longer fully understand, always searching for where they belong. The oud player shifts melodies. A younger mystic, barely more than a boy, recites a list of heaven's feathers, a phrase used for stars that shimmer briefly before vanishing from view. These are not mistakes, he says. They are moments of forgetting and remembering. You glance upward. The stars are, indeed, shimmering more than usual. You know, it's probably just atmospheric distortion, but maybe not entirely. There's one star in particular, low on the horizon, faint, almost winking. You ask the elder what it is. That, he replies, is the bird that never lands. He doesn't elaborate. You sit in silence, letting that settle. Maybe it's an invented name. Maybe it's one of those stars that dances just outside the edge of visibility, like a secret. Or maybe it's not a star at all, but something inside you that refuses to come down. The night grows deeper, one by one. The mystics rise and bow to the stars, not in worship, but in recognition, as if greeting old friends. You remain seated a little longer, eyes tracing the invisible wings overhead. The stars shift slowly, like birds gliding from one season to the next, and you wonder, quietly, if every constellation is a migration somewhere between what we know and what we almost remember. By now, you've wandered through royal courts, dusty domes, merchant wagons, and mystic circles, and somehow, inevitably, you've ended up in an office. It's not quite the kind with potted plants and passive-aggressive scrolls about owl etiquette. This one belongs to an astronomer in Isfahan, and it's stacked with instruments, half-mapped constellations, and at least one falcon feather dipped in gold ink. You're standing behind a desk cluttered with calendar prototypes, circles within circles, wax-coated tables, a sundial shaped like a heron's foot, and right in the middle of it all, a thick folio labeled Bird Cycles and Lunar Drift, a comparative calendar study. You brace yourself. This is going to be nerdy. Deliciously nerdy. You flip open the first page. Apparently, for a brief stretch of time roughly between the late 9th and early 11th centuries, Persian astronomers attempted something bold, building calendars based not just on solar or lunar cycles, but on migratory bird patterns. That's right, avian astronomy. Sky watching with feathers on. One chart in the folio shows a side-by-side comparison of star positions and stork migration records. A note at the bottom reads, "Storks return to Yazd one night before Aldebaran appears in full fire." This pattern repeated often enough that some scholars began syncing harvest seasons not only to moon phases, but to the arrival of specific birds believed to be messengers from constellations. Another sheet shows the calendar of wingspan, where months are color-coded by bird species: falcon for the season of ambition, dove for healing, and hoopoe, a beloved Persian bird, for renewal. Each bird had an associated constellation, and yes, each constellation had its own assigned poem. You try reading one aloud but quickly stop because it rhymes lunar silence with eagle violence. And you're not sure the meter's quite right? Historians still argue whether these calendars were used widely or just a niche experiment by overly romantic stargazers. No royal decrees ever mandated falcon season, but several surviving market records show festivals aligning with return of the heron, which might have been either a celebration or just a very fancy birdwatching party. Either way, people showed up. You trace one timeline where bird appearances were mapped against eclipses. There's a red circle around the year 964 CE with the scribbled phrase, "The goose fell silent. The sun wept fire." No context, no footnotes. Possibly symbolic. Possibly a goose-related weather event. Possibly poetic nonsense. You love it anyway. The room you're in begins to feel smaller as you realize how big this thinking was. These weren't isolated sky observations. They were attempts to tether the heavens to life on Earth, to build a rhythm, to understand time not as a line, but as a flock. And flocks return. That idea, the loop, the return, the nesting, was crucial. One theory you read even proposes that the stars themselves were once birds who chose stillness as a form of devotion. They didn't fall. They perched, permanently, which is either adorable or deeply unsettling. You find one last page heavily annotated, with wine stains and a crude drawing of a pigeon in a crown. It reads, "The calendar is not fixed. Birds change their path. So too must the sky." There's no author, just a fading seal in the shape of a curled talon. And maybe that's the lesson tonight, that even in the world of fixed stars and timeless myths, someone always dares to redraw the lines. To say, actually, that's not a lion. That's a crane with confidence. And suddenly, the sky shifts again. You step outside. The night is unusually still. No wind, no wings, no urgent crow calls in the distance. Just silence. And above you, the quiet glide of constellations with names mostly forgotten except here. In stories like this, you imagine a calendar written in birdsong, ticking forward with flaps and glides, pausing only when a dove lands to drink. The stars above pulse gently. The hoopoe month is ending. The falcon month is near. You're following the sound of shouting now, not the angry kind, well, maybe a little angry, but more the kind that fills a room when too many scholars, merchants, and amateur poets all decide that they, and only they, know what to call a specific star. You're in the middle of a debate, and it's getting heated. The hall is long and dimly lit. Somewhere within the scholarly quarters of medieval Shiraz, lanterns flicker. Someone's quill snaps, and at the center of it all is a wooden table covered in layered charts, ink pots, and one incredibly smug-looking taxidermy goose. Welcome to the great star naming crisis. It started, allegedly, with an innocent suggestion that a newly identified star, faint, flickering, suspiciously duck-colored, should be named Goosefire. Somebody else disagreed. They preferred falcon's claw, and from there, things spiraled. You take a cautious seat in the back as scholars throw down citations, diagrams, poetry fragments, and at one point, a pastry in frustration. One man insists the star represents the goose's heart, compassionate, loyal, slightly edible. Another believes it's obviously the falcon's claw sharp, divine, merciless in flight. A third voice says, "You're all wrong. It's part of the sky chicken," which earns him a slow, judgmental silence. You leaf through a scroll one of them tosses aside. It's covered in overlapping star charts, some in Arabic, others in Persian, a few with what you think is Greek, scribbled in the margins. Half the names have been crossed out and replaced with birds, then recrossed out, then doodled over with what may be a pigeon in a hat. This wasn't just a creative disagreement, it was a real naming war. Why? Because by the 11th century, multiple guilds and schools were competing to claim naming rights over new celestial findings. Astronomy was gaining traction, both scientifically and culturally. If you named a star, you didn't just identify it, you owned its legacy. And if your name stuck, it could travel from a court to caravan, from mosque to market, eventually appearing in translated texts that would reach Europe centuries later. Historians still argue whether the Persian bird names were official designations or more like footnotes from bored stargazers. Some ended up in Arabic almanacs. Others survived in astrolabes and travel logs. But many just vanished casualties of scholarly ego and the relentless march of time. One document here refers to the Swan of Silence, likely part of the Cygnus constellation, but someone else has angrily written beside it, in faded ink, "No swans in Persia. Try desert cranes." Underneath that, a third note, "Camels are birds of the earth. Discuss later." You don't? The most fascinating part isn't the bickering. It's the idea that they cared so much that the shape of a wing or the curve of a beak could determine how a whole society interpreted the sky. That calling a star. The crow's voice might imply mischief, while the dove's landing brings hope. Even today, a few bird-inspired names have survived, though they've often been translated, trimmed, or Latinized beyond recognition. Altair comes from Al-Nasr al-Tayr, the flying eagle. Danib from Danab al-Dajaja, tail of the hen. See, the birds are still up there, just harder to spot behind the syllables. You wander toward a faded tapestry hanging near the door. It shows a spiral of stars labeled with bird names in Persian calligraphy. Around the edges, someone's written. One name is never enough, but each name sings something true. You think about that for a moment. Goosefire, falcon's claw, pigeon crown, swan of silence. Maybe the stars don't mind. You step outside, leaving the scholars mid-argument. The night air wraps around you like warm silk. You look up. The stars are utterly silent, as if waiting for you to choose your own names. You whisper one. No one corrects you. It's late now. Late even by poetic. Desert night standards, and you're following a narrow staircase spiraling deep below an ancient ziggurat that no one really remembers building. Dust clings to the air like it's been waiting centuries just to settle on your sleeve. A lamp flickers in your hand, casting shaky halos across old bricks. And at the end of the corridor, you see it, a sealed wooden door, marked with a single carved feather. You push it open. Welcome to the Forgotten Observatory. Or, depending on who you ask, the Secret Bird Vault. The room is small, circular, and lined wall to wall with ancient star charts stacked like loaves of scholarly bread. In the center, a brass instrument shaped like a bird's beak points upward through a tiny hole in the ceiling, a pinhole view of the stars above. No grand telescope, just enough to track one constellation at a time. Intimate, patient, bird-like. This place isn't listed in any major academic record. It doesn't appear in royal archives or Sufi poems or the debates of the star-naming guilds, but someone cared enough to build it. And based on what you're seeing, it was made for one purpose, to map the Firebird. You pause. You've heard the name before, Simurgh, Anka, Phoenix, depending on the century, depending on the mood. But here, it's more than myth. This observatory is dedicated to charting its paths. A scroll pinned to the wall reads, "When the Firebird flies, 3 stars flare. One at dusk, one at zenith, one at forgetting." Cryptic. Of course, But as you leaf through the dusty star maps, some drawn in saffron ink, others singed at the corners, you notice a pattern. Each one highlights the same 3 stars. They don't form a neat triangle. They don't even belong to the same constellation. But they move in rhythm, season after season, in a kind of silent flight formation. One at dusk, a red star in the west, possibly Antares. One at zenith, a white star overhead, maybe Vega. One at forgetting, a fading blue star near the horizon. Perhaps Fomalhaut, you feel a little tingle in your spine. Just a small one? Like a feather-brushing bone, these stars were watched not for navigation, but for storytelling. Each marked a phase of some grand celestial metaphor: desire, illumination, and letting go. The Firebird wasn't just a creature, it was a cycle. And someone down here believed it left trails in the sky. You trace one chart where the Firebird's wingspan is imagined. Across 9 constellations, the quills stretch from Cygnus to Phoenix to Aquila, each chosen for their brightness and emotional significance. One note reads, "She carries the grief of Orion and the joy of Cassiopeia, but answers to no one." Historians still argue whether this was serious astronomy or some kind of emotional coping mechanism disguised as scholarship. But honestly, does it matter? The Firebird was how they told stories the stars wouldn't say out loud. You find a copper box in the corner, sealed with wax and a small obsidian feather. Inside, bird bones wrapped in parchment, marked with star coordinates. Creepy. A little. But one scroll suggests they use these bones in ceremonial alignments, placing them in mirrored positions to the stars above, like a feathered astrolabe, a tactile, bone and sky calendar. One scholar wrote, "Only when the Firebird's skeleton matches the heavens shall she rise again." You quietly put the bones back. Before you leave, you notice a final chart. It's the only one painted instead of drawn deep blue background. Gold star dots, and in the center, a glowing bird, wings outstretched, tail aflame, eye closed. There's no label, just a sentence at the bottom. What rises burns. What burns becomes light. What becomes light names the stars. You step outside, blinking into the night. The 3 stars are there, red, white, blue, softly flickering in their ancient rhythm. You raise your hand. The sky is cool against your palm. Somewhere, the Firebird flies, and this time, you're watching. You wake up slowly, this time on your back, on soft grass, under a sky that feels just slightly too big. It's not a garden, or a palace, or a scholar's den. You're in the countryside now. The stars overhead are sharp and untamed. There are no observatories nearby, no astrolabes, just a small hilltop, a flickering campfire, and a shepherd humming to himself as he carves a flute from apricot wood. You've stumbled into stargazing's original classroom. The field. The shepherd nods to you. The birds are flying tonight, he says. You follow his gaze, but see only stars. You nod anyway. This isn't scripted astronomy. It's instinctive, generational, and very, very bird-themed. He points out a cluster above the eastern ridge. See those 3? That's the Sparrow Gate. Every spring, the real sparrows pass right under it. Or so my grandfather said. You smile. This is not peer-reviewed. It's better. As the night stretches on, he names more. That bright one is the hawk's eye. The little dip below it, that's the chick that got lost. The tail end of that line, see? The starling's cry. You raise an eyebrow. Why the cry? He shrugs. No one knows. But when my sheep go missing, it's always when that star's out. Historians still argue whether rural communities like this preserved older, pre-scientific constellations or just invented their own to pass time. Probably both. But what's clear is that even far from the centers of learning, people looked up and saw wings. You lie back on the grass. The ground is cool. The air smells like time and sleep. And slowly, the constellations rearrange themselves not in science's precise lines, but in soft, wandering shapes. A lopsided duck, a hesitant crane, a peacock with only half a tail. Not all of these stars match any known cluster. One looks like a comet, but isn't. Another pulses faintly with a blue edge that reminds you of a jay's feather underwater. You're not sure what it is. The shepherd calls it bird that never flew. What does it mean? He shrugs. Maybe it was born up there, never came down. There's something touching about that. A sky full of birds that never left, Creatures of motion, frozen in light, still remembered even if no one agrees on their shape. In one corner of the sky, you spot a zigzag of faint dots. It reminds you of a broken wing. The shepherd calls it the sleepy rooster, says it only rises when it's time to rest. You believe him. One scroll you read earlier mentioned extinct stars constellations no longer used, birds no longer recognized, the cloud partridge, the ash dove, the narrow-beaked heron, all once part of someone's sky. Now lost to updated charts and standardization, there's no record of how many bird constellations were abandoned over time. As Islamic astronomy merged with Hellenistic models, many older names were trimmed, translated, or erased entirely. The birds that couldn't find a place in the new system simply vanished. Not from the sky, just from memory. But maybe not entirely. Maybe out here, far from observatories and atlases, someone still calls that star the goose with regrets. And maybe that's enough. The shepherd offers you a sip of tea from a clay cup. It's strong and smoky and definitely not bird-themed, which is refreshing. He tells you one last thing before drifting off. The stars remember what we forget, even the birds. You stay awake just a little longer, watching a faint shimmer glide across the sky. A satellite, probably, or maybe if you're in the mood for softer logic, a late bird. Either way, it doesn't land. It just drifts, content to be part of the silence. You're back in the city now, but not in a palace or observatory. This time, you've wandered into a language school. Don't worry, there's no test, no grammar drills, just the soft scratching of reeds on parchment, the clink of ink bottles, and the occasional groan of someone realizing they've spelled constellation as cousin soup. Again, this is where names become complicated. You take a seat beside a quiet scholar flipping between two nearly identical scrolls. One is in Arabic, one in Persian. Both describe the same stars, but with different birds. The names, she murmurs, don't always survive the translation. You nod, even if you don't fully get it yet. During the golden age of Islamic science, think 8th to 12th century Arabic became the dominant language of scholarship across vast parts of the world. Persian texts were copied, translated, and sometimes lovingly reinterpreted. But not all names made it through intact. You're handed a chart in Persian. One star is called Morgi Sahar, the bird of dawn. In Arabic, the same star becomes Al-Fajr al-Ta'ir, the flying light of morning. Same general vibe, slightly different feathers. Others didn't survive as elegantly. One Persian term, Tehunak, a type of mythical desert bird, got translated as simply Altair, meaning the bird. No drama, no flair, just bird. It's like renaming a phoenix object that is warm. You flip to a different example. Shar-e-Morga, City of Birds, a poetic name for a dense star cluster in the southern sky. But in the Arabic version, it becomes Jama al-Nujum, group of stars. Accurate, sure, but where's the spark? Historians still argue whether these shifts were deliberate simplifications or just the cost of keeping science multilingual. Some believe poetic meanings were trimmed in favor of clarity. Others think the Arabic scribes were trying to standardize chaotic bird references that were multiplying faster than pigeons at a picnic. It wasn't just language, it was worldview. To Persian poets, the stars were metaphors in flight. To Arabic mathematicians, they were coordinates. Both saw beauty, but beauty wore different robes. A student beside you sighs and mutters. They renamed the crow's path Beta Corvi. Latin letters. No feathers, just sadness. It's a real tension. How do you preserve meaning across time and translation? You imagine a scholar staring at a star he once called the feathered witness, now reduced to Gamma Aquili. It's still the same star, but does it feel the same? You lean over a parchment showing an Arabic star map with Persian annotations scribbled in the margins. Little doodles of birds, wings, even one that might be a flamingo if you squint. A quiet rebellion. Maybe, or just someone refusing to let their sky go quiet. You find one odd entry, Al-Nashra, an Arabic name meaning the terror. Once linked to a vulture constellation, the Persian scribe next to it has written, too violent, prefer the patient heron. You chuckle. Even across centuries, translation is mostly just arguing with dead people. One chart lists side-by-side star names across 4 languages. Persian, Arabic, Greek, and somehow Aramaic. The same star, renamed over and over. Bird of the horizon, wingtip of the southern hunter, tail feather of the night goat. Each version revealing more about the culture naming it than the star itself. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the stars are just mirrors, and the names we give them, birds, beasts, bones, or numbers, are just reflections of what we need in that moment. Comfort, control, poetry, or all three. Before you leave, the scholar presses a small card into your hand. It's a chart of bird-named stars that no longer exist in any official catalog. Just 15 names, half of them crossed out. At the bottom, it says, names fall, light stays. You step outside. The moon is high now, but the stars still push through. A few have names you know. Most don't. One overhead glimmers faintly. You decide it looks like a crane. No one objects. You're standing on a crumbling rooftop now, higher than you probably should be, overlooking what used to be a capital city. The wind here doesn't whisper. It groans, tugging at your sleeves like it wants to tell you something but forgot the words. Below you, the domes of old mosques glint like fossils in moonlight. And above you, the stars still burn, but the names feel heavier now, heavier with edits. This is the part where things get rewritten. You've arrived at the age of empire and erasure. As Persia's dynasties rose and fell from Sassanid to Safavid to Qajar, so too did their skies. New rulers brought new religions, new languages, and new interpretations of the same stars. And more often than not, the old birds got evicted. You lean against the chimney of what was probably a poet's house. A tattered scroll flutters nearby, nailed to the roof with a rusted pin. It's a celestial chart, half erased. The peacock's fan is crossed out. The dove of mercy, gone. In their place, military terms, religious reassignments, and blank spaces waiting to be renamed. You feel it in your chest, that quiet pressure of forgetting. The official star catalogs, once full of wings and feathers, became more abstract, more sterile. They adopted Greek names, Latinized letters, geometry over myth, not out of malice necessarily, but out of policy, efficiency, uniformity. Empires don't love poetry. They love maps. Historians still argue whether the shift was inevitable. After all, you can't run a naval fleet with constellations called the Melancholy Finch. But something was lost. Not just names, but tone. Emotion, the birdness of the sky. You find an abandoned astrolabe leaning against a wall. It's missing its pointer, but the base is still etched with a star chart. One section, near the bottom, is labeled Al-Ghurab the Raven. You smile. That one survived. Barely, but beside it, a faint trace of an older name. The bird who waits. You run your finger over it. Faded, like breath on a mirror. The empires didn't just rename. They rewrote. Some star patterns were reshaped entirely to fit theological symbols or imperial metaphors. The crane became the scepter, the heron became the blade, and the peacock. It became problematic, too proud, too royal, too Persian. Some stories weren't erased outright. They were just repurposed. The owl of judgment was turned into a cautionary tale about arrogance. The dove of dawn, once a symbol of love and planting seasons, became associated with mourning. A court document from the Safavid era records a royal astronomer being reprimanded for using pre-Islamic metaphor in his lecture, specifically referring to a star cluster as the parrot's garden. He was reassigned to coastal surveying. The parrot, never mentioned again. You step around a broken sundial. Its gnomon snapped clean off. On the base, someone has etched a desperate little message in faded ink. If the birds fall, who will guide us? It's unsigned. In another rooftop corner, you find a stash of banned manuscripts, scrolls and books with names too poetic, too pre-empire. There's one list that makes your breath catch: 22 extinct constellations, all bird-based. The waiting scribe, the flame-roosted quail, the sparrow with two shadows, the desert finch of the eclipse, the starless swan. None of them appear in modern charts. None were useful, all of them beautiful, and yet something resisted. The common people, merchants, farmers, shepherds kept using the old names, quietly. At night, when no one official was listening, children still wished on the crane's nest. Sailors still watched for the Gannet line. Some scholars secretly kept two star maps, one for their job and one for their heart, because even under empire, memory has wings. You look up, the stars are still there, older than dynasties, older than arguments. Their light comes from so far away, it hasn't heard who's in charge. You whisper the old names, just one or two. You swear one of them answers. You're sitting in a quiet courtyard now, tucked between laundry lines and jasmine vines, watching pigeons argue over a crust of bread. The stars are out, the air is soft, and for the first time tonight, the sky doesn't feel sacred or royal or even particularly mystical. It feels domestic. Which brings us to the most humble chapter in the great celestial bird saga, how stars became pets. Yes, really. As astronomy drifted from courts and scrolls into daily life, so did the metaphors. People began comparing stars not to mythical beasts or cosmic symbols, but to the birds they saw every day. The cranky sparrows, the doves nesting on windowsills, the show-off pigeons who strutted like they had somewhere important to be. These were the new celestial guides. You lean against a low wall as an old woman waters her herbs and points to a faint twinkle overhead. That one, she says, is the hen who forgot. You blink. She shrugs. She laid her eggs, then wandered off. It happens. The star is probably Vega, but tonight, it's hers. A few centuries earlier, there was an informal tradition among domestic stargazers, often women, servants, or village school teachers, of giving stars local bird names, the kind that never made it into official charts but stuck anyway. Names like the shy rooster, the gossip goose, the window dove, the feather that returns. Historians still argue whether these were sincere constellations or just bedtime jokes, but oral tradition suggests people use them to mark household rituals, when to light the evening lamp, when to let the bread rise, when to expect their son back from the mountain pass. In a ledger from 15th century Yazdi, someone even penciled in the phrase, "Pigeon star fades, begin soup." You chuckle. It wasn't science, but it worked. You wander over to a rooftop coop where a boy is feeding grain to doves. He names each bird after a star. Altair, Al-Nasr, Altanira, Salmuk. You ask if he knows those are real star names. He shrugs. They sound like stars, so they must be. A part of you hopes no one ever tells him otherwise. There's something charming, maybe even profound, about these personal constellations. They didn't map oceans or dictate empires, but they brought the sky down to earth, into kitchens, onto balconies, into the hearts of people who had no telescopes, no funding, no guild badge, just stories. One diary from a 14th century weaver includes a note. "The loud pigeon in the sky means I'll dream of my sister." No context, no footnote. Just belief. Quiet and specific. You pause at a faded mural on a garden wall. A sky painted in soft gray. No Orion, no Leo, just pigeons. Dozens of them, flying in clumsy formation, each one painted next to a star. Some are upside down. Some look like shoes with wings, but it is perfect. You sit beneath it and look up, and you realize something. We talk about the grand stars, the noble birds, the mythic constellations. But it's the small ones, the chickens, the sparrows, the pigeons that linger in memory. Because they were ours, because they stayed, the stars didn't need to be heroic, just familiar, repeating. A kind of feathered clock, a reminder that even in a chaotic world, there were some things, some lights, some birds that kept coming back. A pigeon lands beside you, stares, blinks. You point upward. That one's you. He looks unimpressed, but you smile anyway. You're standing alone now, at the edge of a quiet field, where the stars are no longer sharp, they're soft, almost smudged, like breath on glass. The wind has calmed, the world around you feels paused, and above, the sky is full of birds that aren't really birds. Not anymore. Because this is where it ends. Not the stars. Not really. Just the naming of them. The remembering. The retelling. And maybe the letting go. You stare up and see one final constellation barely there. Just a few faint points of light. It's not on any official chart, not in any observatory scroll or dusty poet's journal, but it's there. You decide to call it the quiet wing. No one can stop you. That's the gift of the night sky. It doesn't care what we name it, but it holds those names anyway, gently, secretly, forever. You remember the first rooftop? The first whispered metaphor, a dove's tail flickering in moonlight. And now, after deserts and domes, debates and doves, you're still looking upward. Somewhere above you, Altair blinks. Once the flying eagle, once just Altair the bird, now buried under technical charts and magnitude indexes. But still there, so many of the bird stars are gone now, not erased, but overwritten, pushed into footnotes. Their feathers flattened into data tables. Historians still argue whether these names were ever real, whether the herons and sparrows and mythical phoenixes truly filled the Persian sky, or if we've imagined them from scraps and wishful thinking. But you know the truth. Of course they were real. They were sung, scribbled, sighed. They were whispered during eclipses and scribbled on shipping logs and stitched into silk. Real not because they endured in libraries, but because they flew in someone's imagination, and some of them still flicker in ours. Above you now are stars named after birds who no longer exist. The desert quail, the starless swan, the crane that never returned. They're extinct on Earth, but still glowing in the sky. Quiet, steady, refusing to disappear. You close your eyes. You imagine the sky not as a chart but as a flock, not fixed, but moving, migrating, looping. Each star a wingbeat of something ancient, something fragile, something brave enough to shine in silence. Maybe the stars were always birds. Maybe we've just forgotten how to hear their songs. And now, you're lying down, arms folded gently over your chest. The grass beneath you is cool and forgiving. The stars above are soft now, no longer dazzling or demanding. Just there, like nightlights for your breath. The sky doesn't ask for anything. It never did. It lets you come and go, look and forget, name and rename. You take a slow breath, then another. Let it deepen. You think of the ancient astronomers tracing wings into parchment, whispering birds into the dark. You think of poets who gave the stars personalities, of mystics who saw their own souls reflected in the arc of a dove's flight. You think of farmers, lovers, children all gazing up, wondering who put birds in the sky and gave them names we could never quite pronounce. The constellations blur gently now, edges soften, wings fold. They are not maps anymore. They're lullabies. Somewhere overhead, the firebird circles, still glowing, still flying, still just out of reach. You feel the night settle around your ribs. Not heavy, not tight, just enough. You don't need to remember the names, or the arguments, or which star was whose. Just know they were loved, that they mattered. And that even now, birds of light still perch quietly above us waiting for someone, anyone, to look up and call them home again. Sleep well now. The sky is still full of wings.